focusing on. And they can become citizens through a process that is called naturalization. The Constitution itself empowered Congress to create rules governing naturalization. Second, the Constitution prohibited Congress, at least before 1808, from prohibiting what it called the migration or importation of a group mysteriously referred to as such persons. Now, debaters of the Constitution all understood that such persons was a reference to slaves. And the Constitution was actually empowering Congress to abolish the slave trade, which it did once it was permitted to do so in 1808. As this example suggests, the US Constitution links the regulation of movements of people, migration, to importations and imports. And it's under the Congress's right to regulate foreign trade, the so-called Commerce Clause, that it first gained the right to govern migration. Now, there's another set of references in the Constitution which I won't focus too much attention on, but that seeks to limit the possibility that naturalized foreigners who become citizens can import foreign immigrant political ideologies into U.S. politics. That's why, for example, the president has to be a natural-born citizen. And many people interpret that to mean born on the soil here, and that's why the Constitution places lengthy residency requirements on naturalized citizens who run for the Senate or the House of Representatives. This is the very scant foundation on which U.S. immigration policy has developed over 200 plus years. So let's turn now to the 5 myths and look at them in somewhat greater detail. The first is the myth of unregulated migration. Most Americans today believe that the U.S. in the past so wanted population that it welcomed all comers and that it did not seek to restrict or even to regulate immigration until the late 19th century, when the arrival of the Chinese produced hysterical and racialized demands for exclusion. There is an element of truth to this view of the past, and the U.S. certainly did desire and want white and European settlers for its western lands. But this myth is also a bit too broad, I think, to help us to understand today's policy issues when we consider the issue of class and its influence. For the first half of the 19th century, as I mentioned, Congress saw the regulation of migration as part of its responsibility to regulate commerce and trade. So much like slaves, actually, the immigrants of that time were understood to be a kind of trade good. It was foreign trade treaties that opened U.S. ports to foreign merchants, along with whatever goods they chose to import, including the passengers, we would call them immigrants, who traveled on the merchants' ships. Throughout the first half of the 19th century, Americans regularly spoke of importations of people who we would today call not slaves, but immigrants. The language of slavery and of property, in other words, continued to be applied to these migratory people until the Civil War. References to immigrants as human cargo or as living freight were very common. The word immigrant, however, was scarcely used during this period in congressional debates. Congress regulated both foreign trade in goods and foreign trade in people under the Commerce Clause. And in 1808, when it prohibited the importation of slaves, scholars now see this as the precedent for all subsequent immigration restrictions and exclusions. In 1819, and again in 1847, Congress limited the numbers of passengers, and they called them passengers, that a ship could carry in steerage to 2 persons for every 5 tons of weight. 2 people equals 2.5 tons of freight. Steerage, let me remind you, when it wasn't carrying people, was the place where goods were packed into ships for transportation across the Atlantic Ocean. Congress furthermore required ship captains to report the names and other information about these passengers that were being imported by merchants into the US. And this information, it's interesting to note, was given directly into the hands of government agents who are called customs collectors. In other words, the same government agents responsible for inspecting imported goods and for imposing tariff duties on imports were the same people who were responsible for collecting information about the living freight, the people we would call immigrants. In the 1880s, Congress actually chose to import a kind of tariff or duty on the living freight, a so-called head tax that every immigrant had to pay in order to enter the United States. Now, this linkage of immigration and foreign trade seems very, very distant from us, but it has survived in certain ways into our own times. Remember, for example, what ICE stands for. What does ICE stand for? It stands for Immigration and Customs Enforcement. The same agents who enforce law prohibiting illicit smuggling of goods into the United States are the people concerned about the illicit entry without inspection of human beings. So even in the early 19th century, as the federal government regulated migration and immigrants as if they were trade goods, states, especially in the eastern part of the United States, began to view new arrivals as dangerous human beings. So there's a switch going, there's a transition here. They're humans, but they're also dangerous. By the 1830s, complaints about the arrival of poor people from Ireland and from Germany began to rile city and state politics along the East Coast. These newcomers were viewed as being far too poor and weak to travel to the interior of the country or to become settlers and farmers there. So they were understood instead to be diseased beggars and potential thieves who at the very best would seek wage-earning jobs and at the worst would become public burdens as wards of charity hospitals, workhouses, and prisons. They were seen, in other words, as a potential drain. They were also explicitly and often, as you see here, compared to the free blacks who also sought wages around the docks of port cities. My point here is simply that these earliest of wage-earning working-class immigrants were by no means welcomed. On the contrary, New York and Massachusetts, already in the 1830s, passed laws that required ship's captains, or the immigrants themselves, to pay fees before they could be admitted. Those fees were seen as necessary to relieve the overburdened American taxpayer, you'll hear the resonances to the present, of the supposedly exorbitant costs of supporting immigrants during periods of unemployment, of providing charity and health care for the indigent. In fact, of course, then, as now, foreigners were far more likely to work for wages than citizens, and the poorhouses of American cities were actually full of recently arrived immigrants from rural America, many of them widows and children, rather than recently arrived foreigners. But that fact was as lost on the angry taxpayers of the 1830s as it seems to be on taxpayers today. Long before Ellis Island in New York or Angel Island in San Francisco, New York State built this grand edifice called Castle Garden, in part to try to begin to separate the diseased from the healthy and the work-ready from the shirking paupers. Castle Garden was built in part to protect America from those European nations that were accused, and here I quote, of shoveling out their own paupers, trying to force the United States into bankruptcy. And as this quote shows you, already in the 1830s, immigrant workers were imagined as a burden and as a foreign invasion sent there by hostile governments in Europe. Repeatedly, however, in these years, the 1830s, the 1840s, and the 1850s, when states passed rules that excluded or restricted the entry of immigrants, the Supreme Court eventually intervened. Ships' captains and merchants complained, and the Supreme Court repeatedly passed down judgments that said only the federal government has the power to regulate foreign trade, and therefore only the federal government has the power to regulate migration. It's only after a long period of squabbling and civil war, I would add, over the issue of states' rights vis-a-vis the federal government, that Washington begins to listen to American voters who are furiously upset about immigrants and its dangers. Congress in the 1870s and 1880s began to respond to Westerners whose racialized fear of the Chinese, who began arriving in the 1850s, had begun to mount before the Civil War. And they also began to respond to the Easterners who had been seeking relief, as they saw it, from the paupers of Europe since at least the 1830s. As this suggests then, both class and race-based hostilities shaped the history of the earliest restrictions and regulations on American immigration. Now let me tackle the complex issue of racialized exclusions in U.S. immigration policy and history. The belief that it was racism driving U.S. immigration policies and restrictions is not so much wrong as it is incomplete. Racialized exclusions have been part of U.S. immigration policy since 1790. Congress, you'll remember, empowered by the Constitution, was allowed to create rules for naturalization. And from 1790 onward, Congress limited naturalization explicitly to white foreigners. It used the word white. That exclusion, however, fell incrementally over the next century and a half. After the Civil War, for example, constitutional amendments that were intended to guarantee the rights of former slaves made foreigners of African descent eligible for naturalization already in 1870. Foreigners from Asia were another matter. They repeatedly challenged their exclusion from citizenship, but only in 1943 did foreign-born Chinese gain the right to become citizens, although their American-born children were always considered citizens. Only in the aftermath of World War II did all immigrants from Asia and from other parts of the world gain the right to naturalize. So there is a history of racialized exclusion. Most histories of U.S. policy at the border trace racialized exclusions to the 1882, you've heard of it, I'm sure, Chinese Exclusion Act. Yet, if you look at that law and the policy it generated, that is not what the law accomplished. Nor was the law even called an exclusion at the time. Contemporaries called the 1882 law the Chinese Restriction Law, for it forbade entry into the United States only to Chinese-born workers. It's only workers who are excluded in 1882. Now, historians who specialize in the study of immigration policy know very well that this was a class-based restriction and one that was also based on national origins. It was the Chinese worker who was excluded, not every Asian worker. Remember, too, that the 1882 law did not restrict the entry of workers from all countries in Asia, nor did it restrict the entry of merchants, students, or professionals, even from China. At the border, well-born, well-off, and well-educated Chinese were, in fact, subjected to humiliating detentions and nitpicking examinations by immigration officers. They were forced to prove somehow that they were not laborers, usually by showing their uncalloused hands, but they were not usually excluded from the United States. The federal government repeatedly intervened in California's detention of Chinese merchants and said, you gotta let them go. This violates the law. that we've got. In 1907, faced with renewed protests from Californians angry about the latest immigrant group, President Theodore Roosevelt negotiated an agreement with Japan in which the Japanese government also agreed to prohibit